Welcome to Domain 2, Business Continuity, Disaster Recovery, and Incident Management. And 10% of the questions you're going to get on the exam are going to be from Domain 2. Domain 2 is a pretty small domain, and it's focused on what do we do when everything else we have in place fails, all the protections. We're going to look at BCP, which is the overarching plan, our business continuity plan, many of the subplans that has, and specifically the disaster recovery plan because that focuses on IT. And then as the last part of this domain, we're going to look at incident management. How do we prepare, detect, respond, mitigate, report on, and recover from incidences? All right, let's get started on Domain 2. In the next couple of lectures, we're going to talk about BCP or Business Continuity Planning. We will also briefly touch on DRP, Disaster Recovery Planning, since it is such an integral part of our BCP. But for DRP in depth, we're going to cover that in later lectures. Given enough time, any organization will have a disaster. It is not if, it is when. And it's our job to make sure that many of those don't happen. We've talked about this already, right? That is our risk assessments. Those are all of our controls. Now we need to talk about what happens when we can't prevent them. How do we minimize the impact of a disaster so we can continue to function as a business? If the disaster is bad enough, we may be severely impacted or we may have to close. And this is not me trying to scare you. There was a reasonably large study done where they looked at all the companies that had suffered major data loss. 43% of all those companies and organizations never reopened. Another 29% of them closed within the next 2 years. That is 7 out of 10. And even with that knowledge, many businesses and organizations choose not to focus on disaster recovery or business continuity because they think it is too expensive. But I can guarantee you, if the business fails and we have to close our doors, most realize it is definitely not too expensive. It would have been many times cheaper to pay attention to our BCP and DRP. Sure, there might only be a 5% chance of this specific thing happening, but are you okay with a 5% chance of the company collapsing? In most cases, the C-suite and the CEO are definitely not. So the BCP, the Business Continuity Plan, is the large overarching plan. It has a lot of subplans below it, and the BCP focuses on the entire organization, not just IT. And this is where we put the numbers to all the risks. We have the quantitative risk analysis where we can see where do we need to focus our energy and our money. We then implement those countermeasures, and then they are going to fix many of the problems, right? Because many of the countermeasures will help with multiple things. But sometimes that's just not enough, which is why we need the BCP. And as part of that, we create our long-term strategic business plans. We have our policies, we have our procedures. So when things go bad, we have a disaster, we are very clear on what we need to do and also what we need not to do. And again here, everything is based on a cost-benefit analysis. And you can think of the BCP similar to our policies. The policies are high level, they are overarching, and then from those policies, we build our procedures. This is the same thing. We have our BCP, we know what is important for us to continue as a business, then using that we build the subplans, the disaster recovery plan, and everything else. I don't think for the exam that you need to know in great detail what these subplans are, but I do think you need to understand what they are, what they do, how we use them, at least on the surface. So first off, we have our COOP, Continuity of Operations Plan. And that is the plan that focuses on how do we continue to operate all our day-to-day business functions when we have a disaster. That is payroll, customer support, HR, whatever we do, how do we make sure that all that keeps happening? And we need to understand that this is a disaster scenario. We don't need to be up to full speed on everything, but maybe we have decided that we're okay with customer support at 25%. So while the disaster is happening, customer support is 25% of what it normally is, and it stays that way until we're back to normal production. So to get that 25%, how do we do that? Then we have our crisis communication plan. We have very specific people who are the only ones who are allowed to communicate both internally and externally. If you're not part of that team, you do not talk to the press, and you don't talk internally even if you are asked questions. There has been some horrible examples where the completely wrong people talk to the press And sometimes those wrong people can be the CEO. When BP had that major oil spill in the Gulf, the CEO came out and said it was too bad that he had to cancel his vacation, and he was definitely the person that was most affected by the oil spill. At this point, 11 people were dead. Tens of thousands of people would lose their jobs, huge impacts to wildlife, nature. That whole coastal region would never be the same. But clearly, we need to feel bad for him because he had to cancel his vacation. So probably we shouldn't have someone who is completely out of touch with regular people and empathy be the person that talks to the press. We need someone who has had the proper training, who has awareness, who has empathy, and they then need to understand how to most effectively and efficiently give the press the information that they need, no more, no less. And here it's also a good idea if we have regular updates. First off, it shows this is important. Secondly, people know when to expect an update. They're not going to keep asking questions. So if we tell them every 2 hours we're going to give you an update, then they know in 2 hours I'm going to get another update. This is the current status, and most people are just going to follow along with the updates. As the next plan, we have a critical infrastructure plan. And no, not all infrastructure is created equally. Some of our things in our environment are much more important than others. How do we make sure that they are more secure? What can we do to make sure they stay up longer? How can we protect those specific critical assets? Then we would probably also have a cyber incident response plan that covers everything that is online, but in most places by now, that's part of our DRP. And as I mentioned, we will cover DRP in a little bit. For now, the DRP is still a subplan of our BCP, the overarching plan, but there's just so much stuff here that is so important and it is focused on IT, so we are going to spend a couple of lectures just on the disaster recovery plan. And as the last plan we're going to cover this lecture, we have the OEP, the Occupant Emergency Plan. That focuses on how do we protect our staff, our facilities, and the environment in a disaster scenario. And that very heavily focuses on safety and evacuation. Part of this could be our fire drills. In most places, we have fire drills every year, so when an actual fire happens, most people hopefully know what to do. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we're going to continue with more BCP, and we're going to start out with more of the BCP subplans. First up, we have a BRP, and this is not a BCP, it is a business recovery plan, and it contains all the steps that we need to take to restore to normal business operations after recovering from a destructive event. That could be how do we switch our operations back from our secondary site, our backup site, to our primary site. How do we get people back in the building? It's all the practical things that needs to happen for us to recover as a business. And I promise there is only a few more plans that you need to know. So now we have a continuity of support plan that narrowly focuses on the support of specific IT applications and systems. You may also hear it referred to as the IT contingency plan because it only focuses on IT systems. How do we make sure that those critical IT applications and systems are available as much as we need them? And then finally, we have our CMP. That is a crisis management plan. And that gives us that effective coordination that we need when we have a disaster event. It outlines all the steps that management must take. First off, to ensure the safety of personnel. And secondly, that our property is properly protected during a disaster. And this is very testable on the exam. People's lives are always most important. It does not matter if you like your server more, you have to save your coworker first. And a lot of what we do in our BCP and our DRP is completely related to risk management. It is us looking at a scenario and then we find solutions. What do we do if something as simple as a critical supplier closes, or as we've seen during the pandemic, what do we do when there are supply bottlenecks? Is there another way for us to get an additional supplier? Is this something we can buy the same item from at a maybe slightly higher cost? If there is someone like that, well then maybe now is a good time to start building that relationship with them. So if something happens in the future to our primary supplier, we already have that existing relationship with a secondary supplier, and even if they have those higher prices, maybe we just buy 5% of the stuff we need from them, but we have the relationship established. And like I said, this really is much of risk management. What do we do when there's flooding? What do we do if there's a hurricane? What do we do if there's earthquakes? Well, if we focus on our data center, maybe we can move the data center or build a new one in an area that's not prone to flooding, or earthquakes, or hurricanes, if that is possible. Well, and if we can't do that, well then what can we do to mitigate those events? What do we do when staff is snowed in and can't get to work? And yes, that can be a disaster. A disaster is just us being inoperable for 24 hours or more. But what if they can work from home? What if we already have all that set up? If everybody already know what to do, they know how to work from home, well then that impact is just going to be there. And that is really what we do with our BCP and our DRP. We go through all the scenarios that are likely to affect us, then we rate them on how likely are they to happen and how bad is it if it does. Remember, qualitative risk analysis, and then based on that analysis, maybe we do quantitative. We implement that one countermeasure that may fix multiple things. Let's say that we have just one data center, and if that area had flooding, it would severely impact us. If our organization is big enough to build a secondary data center, well then we should build that redundant data center somewhere else that is not prone to the same disaster. We would have that secondary site in an area that's not prone to flooding. If those two sites are completely identical and they can both handle the entire load of our data, well then if there's flooding, if there's a hurricane, if there's earthquakes, if someone drives a truck into the data center and destroys most of the servers, from all of that we can pretty easily recover because we have those two identical data centers. We might not even have downtime at all. At some point I worked in an organization where we had two data centers, but they were less than half a mile from each other. That is only 800 meters. So if a disaster hit data center A, it's very likely it would hit data center B as well. So it's really just a horrible way of doing things. I'm pretty sure there were great reasons why they had the data centers so close, but when I worked there, that was one of the things we had a big project for. We built another data center 50, 60 miles away, so about 100 kilometers, and then we had redundant pairs of our critical systems in that remote data center. If something happened to either of the two primary data centers, then all the critical systems would still be up, the non-critical would not. We had gone through that determination. These are the specific systems that have to be up at all times, and these are the ones that were okay with some downtime. If we go back to the example of letting staff work from home, it is pretty funny to see how many of the companies I used to work for where I spent years, literally years, trying to convince them to let people work from home, and I always got told, no, that's just not possible. In 2020, when the pandemic started, all of a sudden, most of the employees in all of those places were allowed to work from home. Every single workplace. And I mean, I've always known that we could, but they just didn't want to. I think it's a mindset of, if I don't see you, then I don't know you're working. But if you have to keep an eye on your employees all the time to make sure they're working, then you hired the wrong people. And with that whole working from home thing, it's a little scary to see how little effort it took to make their staff so much happier. And now that they can work from home whenever there's a snowstorm or people can't get to work, they can work from home. If there's a pandemic, they can work from home. If their kid is sick and they can't find someone to look after their child, well then they can work from home. So that really is a good example of how one countermeasure can mitigate multiple things. Alright, back to our actual BCP. So our BCP and our DRP, just like most things we do, is an iterative process, meaning once we're done, we start over. And that doesn't mean that we update the entire plan all the time. That wouldn't make any sense. In most places, we update it once a year, but if anything changes in our environment during that year, we would add that to the plan. Because if we do the plan today, and in 3 weeks we add 20 new servers, well then they're not part of the plan. If something happens, people look at their plan, they have no clue what to do about those servers, they may not even know that they exist, and they definitely don't know how to restore them. So whenever we make changes to anything in our infrastructure, we update the plan. In most places where I have worked, the BCP has been a collaboration between internal employees in the company that have the specific knowledge and company information we need to build the plan, and then we have external consultants that are used to making BCP plans, and they have that in-depth experience of what should be in the plan, how to mitigate many of the disasters we may encounter, and when we have both those teams, we can make pretty good plans. And of course, here for our internal employees, we need the right ones. We need to make sure that these are the people who know what they're talking about, not just some random person from a specific group who doesn't have the in-depth knowledge that we need. Luckily, with our BCP and DRP and many of the things we can do to mitigate or prevent disasters, there are standards that we can use, which is awesome. Because first of all, it's going to make our jobs much easier. Secondly, since this is not something we do every day, all day, there might be some critical stuff that falls through the cracks. So here, along with using the external consultants, we can use those publicly available frameworks and standards, and this is also something I would know for the exam. Again here, you don't need to know it in depth, but I would recommend being able to take these out of a list. First off, we have NIST SP 800-34, and that focuses on contingency planning. What are the interim measures we can take to recover our information systems after disruption? Then we have ISO 22301 that focuses on business continuity management systems, and it's supported by ISO 27031, and that is advice on how to work with business continuity management. And then finally, maybe know the Business Continuity Institute. They have a 6-step process that are called Good Practice Guidelines, GPG, that also focuses on business continuity. When we talk about our BCP and DRPs, we need to think of them as projects. They're built on a project lifecycle, where, like I mentioned, the BCP is the overarching plan, that is the vision, and it covers the entire enterprise. The DRP is system specific. What do we do, how do we do it, and when do we do it? And the DRP is focused on IT. And since I just projects, let's talk a little bit about the difference between projects and operations. A project has a clearly defined start and a clearly defined end. And that doesn't mean that it's not something we can use for an iterative process. When we're done, we just start over. The output from this iteration becomes the input to the next one. So in a project, we start with project initiation. That is where we officially start the project. We get the stakeholders we talked about earlier, and those are the appropriate people we need for this project. Then we get the buy-in and approval from senior management. We formalize the structure of the project. Then we look at what is in scope and what is out of scope for this project. We talked about that already. We need to be very specific about what we are doing and what we're not doing. And to get that right scope, we need the stakeholders. While we in IT and cybersecurity have a lot of knowledge of what's going on the IT side of things, we normally don't know a whole lot of what's going on the operation. In most places, operation side are the people who know how critical specific systems are. What can we be without and what can we not be without? So really, the key differences between projects and operations is keeping the lights on. It's doing the same task over and over, all the stuff we need to function as a business. That is our payroll, customer service, HR, all the things we maintain. We make sure that we pay our staff, all the things that we need to keep functioning as we are right now, but it is not growing. That is what projects do. Projects move us from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. They are unique temporary endeavors, meaning they have a fixed start time, they have a fixed end date, they also have a fixed budget. And while both the end date and the budget might change during the project, they are still fixed. So operations is keeping status quo where we are now, projects is moving us forward. They are what's going to help us with fulfilling our mission and our vision, and most projects are small. They're going to get us there all by themselves. But there could be hundreds and hundreds of projects that we do over years that gets us from where we are now to where we want to be. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one where we finish out BCP. In this lecture, we're going to finish out BCP. We start out talking a little bit more about how our BCPs and DRPs are projects, and since they are projects, we start with project initiation. Here, we scope the project, and then we do a business impact analysis. And the business impact analysis is another huge topic for our BCP and the DRP. It is exactly what the name sounds like. We analyze the impact to our business. Here, we go in and we identify and prioritize all the critical assets and components in our organization. I think in pretty much any place I have worked in, and I think it's common across the globe, we would have some sort of tier system. And then we assign the different systems and functions that we have to those tiers. Let's say we have 5 tiers. Tier 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. then each of those tiers have different requirements. Maybe for tier 0, we can have 0 minutes of maximum tolerable downtime. That means that all services and servers in tier 0 cannot be down at all. Then tier 1 might be 5 minutes. Tier 2, 3 hours. Tier 3, 1 day, and tier 4, maybe a week. Since we have already identified and prioritized all of our infrastructure because we did that in the risk analysis, we already know which tier each of the servers and services fit into. Then in the business impact analysis, we look at our current preventative controls. What do we have in place now? And what should we have in place in the future? Remember here, preventative controls prevent things from happening. Then we look at our recovery strategies. How do we recover most efficiently and effectively? And all of this is obviously based on what we are recovering from and which systems we are recovering. What can we do to both recover in a timely manner and in a financially viable way? Then once we have that, we go in and we design and develop our plans. At this point, it is a specific recovery plan. It's the procedures we use, the guidelines that we have for our teams, and the tools they need for the disaster scenario. It's all the practical stuff. Then we implement some of the countermeasures. We do the training where we raise the user's awareness, so we change their behavior, and then we do testing. And part of the training is also to make sure that staff can actually handle the incident when it happens. They of course know how to act according to the plan, but it's also to make sure there are no holes in our plan. If everybody knows what they need to do, it makes it much more likely for everything to happen in the right sequence. But if we don't do this, well then what if the person that's supposed to bring the backup tapes is not included? Sure, we can rebuild the system, we know how to restore, but if we don't have the backup tape to restore with, well then we're going to exceed our maximum tolerable downtime. So it's both the training, but it's also to find all the gaps in the plan. And then once we've done all that, we have done the implementations, the training, the testing, we have improved the plan, then we go into maintenance. And really here, since it is an iterative plan, we just revert back to initiation. And then we do that every year, or if anything changes. If something changes, well then we update that part. What we just talked about should not be confused with the uptime tiers data centers. They have 4 tiers that you can classify a data center into, and the more resilient, the more redundant that a data center is, the higher tier. With tier 1, they can't have a single point of failure, a UPS or HVAC or something like that, and then the higher up we go in the tiers, the more redundant they are. With tier 4, regardless of whatever fails, a system, the HVAC, the power, the UPS, there is redundancy for everything. And if you want to look a little more at the Uptime Institute, you can go to uptimeinstitute.com/tiers. Alright, back to the lecture. I think this is also an appropriate time to talk about the different types of disaster categories. We have 3 of them. They are natural, human, and environmental. Personally, I think they make sense. But I have had some students that struggle a little bit with the environmental one. This is things in our environment. It is not the environment. It's not nature. But it is important to understand these 3 because they are such an integral part of our disaster recovery. Some things can be all 3, like a fire. A fire can start naturally by a lightning strike or just high heat. A forest fire can be natural. And with climate change, we're seeing such big fires now that we haven't seen before. I used to at some point live in Central California, and some parts of the year, the sky was completely yellow because there were that many fires. And the reason why it's important to know about the different categories is because how we protect against them is also different. If it's the forest fire, well then we can build outside of a forest. We can build in areas that's not historically prone to large fires, but that changes, right? Then a fire can also be started by a human. They can start a fire in our building, and how we protect against those 2 is completely different. The fire could also be a server that's malfunctioning and catching on fire. Since it's a server, it's probably happening in our data center. Well then, how do we put that out? So even though fire is still fire, depending on which category, our protections, our countermeasures are going to be completely different. So fire can be all 3, so could water. And just remember here, if you go through different threats and try to categorize into these categories, remember that environmental is our environment. It's the servers, the racks, the buildings, the HVACs, the UPSs. Nature is, well, nature. And people are, well, people. Alright, let's finish out BCP. We have already talked about how, if we make changes to our system, we need to update the plan, but the same goes if we make any changes to our infrastructure or we have a change to leadership. The first 2 make sense, right? We understand that if our infrastructure or our systems change, we need to add that to the plan so we know how to restore those. Makes sense. because if they're not part of the plan, how do we know how to restore them? The last one with senior leadership, I have had a lot of students who question that one. Why would changes to our leadership change the BCP? And the reason is senior management is ultimately liable. They are the people who sign off on the BCP. What if we have had a major change in leadership and 75% of them have not signed off on the current plan? First off, of course, they haven't signed off. Secondly, they might not even be on board with what's in it. They might have completely different priorities than what we had when the plan was built. And since they are ultimately liable, if we have a major change to senior leadership, we need to build a new plan. We need them involved. They need to sign off on the plan, and we need them to understand how our BCP and DRP works. And again, they are senior leadership. They don't have to be part of the entire project. They are very busy people, but they have to be involved in the beginning when we do the project initiation, the project charter, because they are responsible for outlining what we are doing here, what is our scope, and then they need to be involved at the very end because they need to sign it. And since they are signing it, they also need to be very clear on what this BCP means. Alright, let's recap. In the last couple of lectures, we talked about our BCP, the Business Continuity Plan, which focuses on how do we continue to function as a business or an organization during and after a disaster. We talked about how the BCP is the big overarching plan that covers the entire enterprise. And then below the BCP, we have a bunch of subplans. The most notable one is the DRP, the Disaster Recovery Plan, and we will start on that one in the next lecture. As some of the other subplans, we have our COOP, Continuity of Operations Plan, how do we continue to operate during the disaster? We have a Crisis Communication Plan, how do we communicate during the crisis and who is allowed to? We have a Cyber Incident Response Plan, with anything that is online, that is often part of the DRP. We have our Occupancy Emergency Plan, and many, many more. We talked about how our DRP and our risk management is tied closely together because it really is us going out and looking at all the potential risk scenarios and then building solutions for what if that specific scenario happens. And many of our mitigations and countermeasures can mitigate multiple different types of disasters. We talked a little bit about the differences between projects and operations. Projects are temporary, fixed time, fixed budget endeavors that moves us from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. Operations, on the other hand, is keeping the lights on. That is payroll, customer service, maintaining our servers, our software, all the things that we need to do to keep the status quo and do what we do now well. But operations does not move us forward. Then we talked about the business impact analysis. That again ties back to risk management. How affected are we if this happens? How affected are we as a business? And then we talked about the different tier systems that most places have. With tier 0, we may have no maximum tolerable downtime. Those systems have to be up 24/7, 365. Whereas with tier 4 systems, maybe we're okay with being down for a week. And of course, not to be confused with the Uptime Institute and their tiers for data centers. Then we talked about the 3 different disaster categories: natural, human, and environmental. Natural is nature. It is earthquakes, hurricanes, naturally occurring fires. Human is something done by humans, and that doesn't mean it has to be intentional. It can just be someone doing something that they're not supposed to. They may not even know they're not supposed to, but the impact can be just the same. It's something that's done by people. And then finally, we have environmental, and that's all the things in our environment. Our servers, our building, HVAC, UPS. It is not the environment, it is not nature. And we talked about how some things can be all 3, water or fire. Fire could just be a naturally occurring forest fire. It could be someone lighting our building on fire, or it could be equipment, environmental, that catches on fire. And then finally, we talked about how we need to update our BCP when our infrastructure, our systems, or a significant part of senior leadership changes. First two make sense to most people. If we have changes to our infrastructure or our systems, we need to update the plan, because if we don't, we won't be able to restore those systems and we might not be able to use the infrastructure. And senior management makes sense because they are ultimately liable. They sign off on the plan, they own the plan. If 75% of them are not on board, they haven't signed the plan, well then we need to make a new plan that they can agree with. Maybe with that many people new in senior leadership, our direction changes. Well then the plan has to reflect that. And with that, we are done with this lecture and BCP. Thank you for being here. I hope it has been helpful, and I will see you in the next lecture where we start on DRP. how we respond to the disaster and how fast we do it. We start out by doing an initial assessment of the incident, and then we activate the appropriate teams to help us. This is an ongoing process. The more we learn, the better picture we're going to get of the attack, so the further along we go, we might need to involve more different people. Maybe we initially think this is not super bad, but the more we dive into it, the more we learn, we realize this is an actual disaster. So we notify the appropriate staff, you calling your director, and she's then responsible for contacting the network team, the server team, senior management, HR, legal, or whomever. In most cases, it wouldn't be that many. Maybe she calls the networking team calls the server team, she might call someone in senior management, and senior management then contacts legal and HR, because we don't want her to waste 20 minutes to call different people and not activate them soon enough. And here, when we call someone, they would normally be the primary, but we would also have a secondary and a tertiary. And tertiary just really means third, meaning if your director calls the networking manager, but the networking manager doesn't answer, well then she calls someone else. The secondary might be the supervisor or the team lead. If they also don't answer, well then she calls the third person in line. That could be the senior networking person. If Jane is not available, we call Bob. If Bob is not available, we call John. And just to reiterate and be very clear here, we don't assign this to names. Really is, if the server manager is not available, she calls the server manager supervisor. If both the manager and the supervisor are not available, well then she calls the team lead. And the reason we don't assign this to names is because people change jobs so often. We need someone in that role who's responsible for that activity. And then in recovery, when the plan has been activated, people have been notified, then we start acting on our plan. We have done all the initial assessments, and we know these are the appropriate responses at this point. We know these are all the key stakeholders that should be involved. We have a much clearer picture of the disaster and a somewhat solid plan on how to recover. Now, what the response is depends on the disaster. That could be activating our disaster recovery site. It could be to rebuild the systems. It could be moving traffic from one system to another. It really depends on whatever is the appropriate response in this specific disaster. And then when we're done with recovery, then we flow back into mitigation. And this is pre-disaster mitigation. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one where we continue with DRP. In this lecture, we're going to continue with more disaster recovery planning. And I think this is a good point to look more at our business impact analysis, or BIA. We talked about this one before. We analyze the impact to our business based on certain events, the disaster scenario. And what that really means is we identify which systems are critical, how critical are they, and how long is it okay for us to have them down. Which functions are we okay with being without for a while, and which can we not have down at all. And the criticality of a system is determined by the acceptable downtime. Here, as in anything else we do in cybersecurity and IT security, the acceptability might be determined by the cost of recovery, or it might be a legal requirement. If we sit down with senior management and we say, how long is it okay for this specific system to be down, assuming it's a critical system, they're probably going to say, never. We need this up 100% of the time, which we can do. But then you tell them this is going to cost you $40 million because we need to build a completely redundant remote data center. That way we get that completely redundant disaster recovery site, we get the true redundancy that senior management wants. They're probably going to say, okay, maybe we can have that system down for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or half an hour. And then we build the disaster recovery plan based on those numbers. But if we have systems that are so critical they can't have downtime at all, let's say we're a hospital, well then the patient records have to be up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Because if patient records are not accessible to medical staff, people might die. So in that case, maybe we do need that secondary site. Then once we have identified all the critical systems and functional activities, then we assign them to the tier system we talked about earlier. Each tier has a different acceptable downtime, and they also have a different recovery point objective. And the recovery point objective is how much data is it acceptable to lose. Meaning, if the system crashes right now, we can't recover the system. How much of the data on that system is it acceptable to lose? Let's say we have a backup system, and that's a backup of all our data once a week, and only once a week. Well, then we have accepted that we can have an entire week of data loss by configuring that policy. Now, if that system was a tier 0 system, that means we have zero data loss acceptance. It is completely unacceptable for us to lose any data. That could be the patient records. So in that scenario, we would have something that backs up the data every time data changes. And we would most likely also have mirror data in multiple locations. So whenever new patient data is entered, it is backed up and it is stored in multiple locations. I have also mentioned MTD, maximum tolerable downtime, before. Now let's look at what that is. It is obviously how long can a system be down. But that is made up of two variables: RTO, recovery time objective, and WRT, work recovery time. The RTO is the amount of time it will take us to restore the system. That is the hardware. And the WRT, that is the software. How much time is it going to take us to configure the system, operating system programs, load all the backups, and have the system back to put into production? And here are a couple of other key terms that I think you need to know. Mean time between failure, that is how long does it on average take for a certain part to fail. Let's say it is a hard drive. If we know that the mean time between failure for that specific hard drive is 3 years, well then we can calculate how many hard drives do we need to have on hand. If we have 100 disks and they on average fail every 3 years, then depending on how new they are, we could maybe assume that we would use 33 disks every year on average. Next up, we have mean time to repair. And here the keyword is mean. How long on average does it take us to repair a failed system? It is important. This is the average. If we go back to the MTD, maximum tolerable downtime, if we say the maximum tolerable downtime is 4 hours and the mean time to repair is 3 hours, well, that's mostly fine. But it is the average. Sometimes it might take us 5 hours. And now we're outside of the MTD. So if that's the case, we need to find some way to bring the mean time to repair down so we never fall outside of the MTD. And then the last one here, minimum operating requirements, or MOR. That is what is the minimum possible requirements we can run this critical system on for a limited period of time. If this is a normal day-to-day operations, there is no disaster, then we know this system needs this much air conditioning, this much cooling, this much internet speed, this much memory. We know all that. But during a disaster, what is the exact minimum we can get away with and still function until we can fully recover? We might have a certain server that in regular operations needs 256 gigs of memory, but in a disaster scenario, maybe we can get away with 32. Well then, that is the MOR, the minimum operating requirements for memory on that system. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one where we continue with more DRP. In this lecture, we're going to continue with disaster recovery planning, and we're going to start out by looking at disaster recovery sites. I have hinted at those before. Now let's dive a little more into what they actually are. First off, we have a redundant site, and the name sort of makes sense, right? That is the one where the secondary data center is an exact duplicate of our primary site. Everything is completely redundant. It has real-time copies of our data, and it is set up to fail over whenever there's a disaster. If something happens, we automatically switch the traffic over to the redundant site, but in most places where I've seen this, we have had them as active amplifiers, meaning both data centers are processing data at the same time. We are load balancing. And load balancing really just means that we're sharing the load of the data, the processing, between different servers or different data centers. That could be half of the traffic is sent to data center A, the other half is sent to data center B. And with redundant sites, it's important that they're geographically distant. So if anything happens to either of those two sites, for our customers, for our end users, they shouldn't notice at all, because are completely identical, and if for whatever reason data center A dies, then instead of processing data at both sites, now we're just processing at site B. There are some cases where we would only choose to house our most critical applications at the redundant site, but in most cases redundant actually means identical. And since they are exactly the same, they're of course also more expensive. And if we have that truly redundant site, I personally haven't worked anywhere where we did, but if we do, then we have to have that distance between them. They have to be far enough away so it's unlikely that the same disaster is not going to hit both of them. If you remember back to when I talked about when I worked in California and we had those two data centers within half a mile of each other, 800 meters. Horrible design. We fixed it, but that is not the point here. To resiliency through redundancy, we need them geographically distant so they're not affected by the same catastrophe. And that is probably enough for you to know about redundant sites. So, let's look at hot sites. And hot sites are very similar to redundant sites, but they only house the critical applications and critical systems. And at a hot site, it would most often be lower spec systems. Remember, those were the MOR, minimum operating requirements. We have exactly as little hardware spec for everything. That means the servers, the HVAC, the power, the internet, everything. It is the exact least amount that we can get away with. And since everything in that data center is compressed as much as it can be, also cheaper, but it is still a full data center. The footprint is just much smaller. And when I say it is a full data center, that means that we have the redundant UPSs, redundant HVACs, redundant service providers, generators, PDUs, and everything else you have in a regular data center. It's just smaller. If we have a hot site, we would need to fail the traffic over manually. It does not happen automatically, but it should take an hour or less. And with our hot site, it is required that we have near or real-time copies of data for those critical systems. So key difference really here is it is smaller, we fail over manually, and we might not have complete real-time coverage of the data, but it needs to be near real-time. Then the next step down is a warm site. Again here, it's somewhat similar to the hot site, but it does not have the real or near to real-time data transfer. Just like the hot site, it is a fully spec data center, most likely all the same stuff we have at a hot site, but here we need to bring the data to the secondary site and then restore the data. Once the data is restored, the systems are up and running, then we manually fail the traffic over to the warm site. But with the warm site, the switchover and the data restores can take somewhere between 4 and 24 hours, sometimes more. So we need to determine, is it for us as a company or an organization completely unacceptable to be down for 24 hours or more? If it is, well then we probably shouldn't use a warm site. And how long the data restores take really depends on multiple factors. How much are we restoring? Where do we keep our backups? What happens to the primary site? And then based on all those factors, then we can make the determination, is this a site that would be acceptable for us? Next up, we have a cold site. Again here, similar sized, but not a full data center. We have most of the same redundant stuff, but all the stuff that is redundant is the data center itself. We have the UPSs, we have the HVACs, we have the internet service providers, generators. We have everything that a normal data center would have, but we don't have any servers. It's just a site that is ready for us to bring hardware to. We then need to go out and get the hardware, configure it, add the applications, restore the data, and basically rebuild everything. Out of these 4 options, this is obviously the cheapest. But here, recovery can take weeks. I have worked in places where we had redundant sites. I have worked in places where we had hot sites. I don't think I've ever worked anywhere where we had warm or cold sites. And the major reason here, I think, is it's just not cost effective. If we're going to be down for a long period of time and we already have to pay for that infrastructure just sitting there, it in most cases don't make any financial sense to not have a redundant site or a hot site. Another solution we could look at could be a reciprocal site. With reciprocal sites, our organization has a contract with another organization that are in the same line of business that we are in. We would then have 1 or 2 racks of our servers in their data center with our equipment, and it would be connected to nothing on the network outside of their switches. It is completely segmented off from everything else. They would then in turn have 1 or 2 racks at our sites. And the reason why they need to be in the same line of business that we're in is because then they have to adhere to the same legal requirements. When I worked at a credit union, we had a reciprocal agreement with another credit union in another state. Since they had to adhere to the it was okay for us to put our stuff in their data center and vice versa. Another option that has become a lot more prevalent the last 5-6 years maybe is a subscription site or a cloud site. And they are becoming more prevalent because they're just so much more cost effective compared to a hot or a redundant site. They really are the same as any other cloud service. We pay someone else to house our backup servers. And they can either be MOR spec, so the minimum we can get away with, or they can be fully spec servers. Which we choose really depends on what we need. How critical are those systems to us? And they come in so many different flavors. Some of them can be a completely mirrored full production environment up and running 24/7. Well, since we need to use all that compute, all that memory, all that storage, it's going to be more expensive, but probably not as expensive as a redundant site. We could also choose to have the server spun down, meaning they're not powered on. They're just virtual machines, not using memory, not using CPU, they're only using disk space. And whenever we have a disaster, we call the cloud provider, they spin up all our servers, and then maybe within an hour or so, we can be back to limited or full production. So really, depending on what we need from the cloud provider, how much hardware spec we need, how fast we need to be able to restore, how soon we need to be online, all that factors into how cheap or expensive it's going to be. Some of them are really inexpensive, some of them are pretty expensive, but it makes sense with what we're protecting. We could technically also have a mobile site. It's basically just a data center on wheels, either fully self-contained with a generator or one where we need to go plug it in somewhere. Most of them are just a container on a truck. I don't think anywhere where I have worked we have had them, but there are definitely some places where they make sense. And here again, they would have all the same stuff we would in a regular data center. They would have generators, fire suppression, servers, some sort of satellite internet connection. And as I mentioned, I don't think I've seen them used, but that doesn't mean they're not places where they make sense. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one where we finish up disaster recovery planning. And we're going to finish out disaster recovery planning. And I think let's start out with talking about what we do after disruption. Sure, we fix the problem, but how do we make sure that this or something like it doesn't happen again? And part of that answer is lessons learned. If we don't learn from our mistakes, we're going to continue to repeat them. And the next disaster is not going to be exactly like this one. There's still going to be key elements that we can use to either make the next disaster not happen at all, or at least make it less impactful. In the real world, this is often a phase that we skip, and you by now already know that that is a bad idea. And we really use the lessons learned just like we use our exercises and our drills to figure out how can we improve our performance next time. What worked well, what did not work well, what can we improve? And again, here we don't lay blame. The whole idea is what can we do better? And we then use those lessons learned to make our BCP and DRP and any of the subplans better for next time. Because there is going to be a next time. And in many places, us continually updating our BCP and DRP is looked at as both cumbersome and a waste of money. And that's exactly why many organizations don't. But you need to keep in mind here, we only have to use our DRP and our BCP when every other single countermeasure we have in our layer defense has failed. When all of those controls are not enough, then and only then do we need the DRP and the BCP. This is an actual disaster. And if we don't know how to respond to that disaster, if we haven't updated our plans, well then we might very easily end up in the group of 72% of the businesses that either never opened again or were closed within 2 years of having major data loss. We have already talked a little bit about some of the things and some of the common mistakes that we make when we make our BCP and DRP. And if we make those mistakes, that makes our plans ineffectual and not really matter much. But just to finish this section out, let's look at some of the top reasons why our BCP and DRP may not work. First off, if we do not have senior management's buy-in. This is just like anything else we do in IT and cybersecurity. We have to have that buy-in for at least initiation, and then when we're done with the plan, to approve it. We need that top-down approach, because if senior leadership is not on board, why would any of the other functional teams be? If we don't have that involvement from senior leadership, if we don't have that buy-in, well then we're probably also going to be missing critical people from the business units. While we know how to fix things on the IT side, we really need the rest of the organization involved to make sure that the countermeasures and mitigations that we have in place actually work and that they're protecting what they're supposed to. And those key stakeholders from those business units are so critical because we need to make sure that the scope we have is actually the scope we should have. We need them to understand what is mission critical and what is not. If they don't care, if they don't participate, the plan is not going to be effective or efficient. I have worked in places where we didn't have the right stakeholders. And in many cases, it's not because they don't want to. It's not because they don't think this is important. But often departments are understaffed. If they don't have enough staff to just keep the lights on for the regular operations, well then projects like BCP and DRP is not going to get a lot of attention. Which again here is why the buy-in from senior management is so critical. If we have that buy-in, then the rest of the leadership in the organization will most often fall in line. They will do what they're supposed to. Alright, next up, we have a too narrow scope. If our scope is too narrow, that means that we're only focusing on the things that we think are critical, and this again ties back to the senior management involvement, getting the right stakeholders. If we don't have the right stakeholders, we are probably not going to have the right scope. Because as an IT professional, I might think these systems are critical. If we take the example of a hospital again, then I might think, okay, patient records are critical. They need to be accessible at all times. Makes sense, right? But all the other things, what if we can't access pharmacy or imaging or any of the other things that we need to treat the patients? We don't know about all those things unless we have the right stakeholders that can help us get the right scope. So it all ties back to that critical buy-in from senior leadership. And just like we need the key stakeholders to build the plan, we also need them as we're testing the plan, all the drills and the exercises. Sure, the IT side of things, we can get everything up and running in the right amount of time. But as IT, we might not know how everything interconnects. We need those functional teams that actually use the software. And the last one here I think makes sense just like the rest of them. If we don't update our BCP and our DRP and something happens, the plan might not do much at all. Because like in my example where the plan was 10 years old, first off, we don't have the systems we did 10 years ago. We also don't have the same staff. The procedures are entirely different, even if it's not 10 years old, even if it's just the wrong version, just one version prior. If we change the IP scheme for entire organization 6 months ago, we updated the DRP like we're supposed to version 10. If Bob is logging in from home as we're having the disaster and starts trying to fix things with version 9, he has all the wrong IP addresses. Either what he does nothing, or he can break things even more. So versioning is very critical. And that's also why when we update the plan, we retrieve all the old plans and we make sure that only the current version is accessible. If people have hard copies, they need to old ones in, and then they need to get the new ones. Because when we are in that disaster scenario, people don't always think clearly. They tend to react, they're panicking, we need to do something quickly, I need to go get the plan, they grab the plan they see first, and then they start doing things. So if Bob grabs the wrong version, bad things can happen. Alright, let's read. In these lectures, we talked about disaster recovery planning. And here we have to answer at least 3 basic questions. What is the objective and purpose of the plan? Who are the people and teams responsible in case a disruption happens? And what do they need to do when we have a disruption? And then we'll talk about we need to be very clear on who can declare a disaster and the different levels of how bad it needs to be for something to be a disaster. We talked about the chain of communication. Who needs to inform who, and it mostly shouldn't be the IT team. We are busy fixing the problem, so we need someone on the non-technical side. Then we talked about the DRP lifecycle. We start with mitigation, and that is pre-disaster mitigation and preparation. That is all the plans we make, the education, the processes, the training. Then we have the response. How do we react in the disaster? We follow the plans. Then we have recovery. How do we re-establish basic functionality, and how do we get back to full production? Then we look some more at the business impact analysis, the BIA. Here we looked at how do we make sure we have the right mitigations and right countermeasures in place. How can we make sure that critical systems recover in a timely manner? And we talked about how we can have recovery systems that are spec'd with minimum operating requirements. That is the exact minimum amount of hardware specs that we can get away with and still be functional. We then talked about disaster recovery sites. We had redundant sites. They are a mirror copy of our primary data center, or at least the critical applications. In most places where I've seen them, they have been active pairs, meaning data is being processed on both servers in both data centers. Because there's really no point in having a fully spec'd data center just sitting there doing nothing. Then we had hot sites, for the ones where we only house the critical applications, and they're spec'd with the MOR, minimum operating requirements. It's still a full data center with redundant UPSs, PDUs, generators, HVAC, but it's a much smaller footprint. And at the hot sites, we would have near real-time or real-time copies of the data for those critical systems. And we had a warm site, very similar to a hot site. All the hardware and the data center is the same. We have the same lower spec systems, but here we would need to bring the backups to the warm site and then do restores on the systems. And once that's done, we manually switch the traffic over to the secondary site. That can take between 4 and 24 hours, sometimes more. Then we have the cold site, and that is the one where we only have the data center. We have the UPSs, the HVACs, the generators, everything else. We have the physical building, but we don't have any of the servers. We need to bring everything there, install it, configure it, add the applications, restore the data, and here recovery can take weeks. Then we also talked about reciprocal sites or reciprocal agreements. That is us having an agreement with someone else in the same line of business, and we then have 1 or 2 racks of our servers in their data center completely segmented off on their network, and they have the same in ours. They have to be in the same line of business because then we assume they're compliant with the same regulations that we have to be. Obviously, we need to confirm that. We also talked about mobile sites. basically a data center on wheels, most often in a container, either fully self-contained or we need to go hook it up to power and internet somewhere else. Here again, it's only the critical stuff, but it is a fully contained data center, HVACs, UPSs, generator, whatever. Then we talked about what most backup sites are now, cloud subscriptions, and that can range all the way from minimum operating requirement systems that are not powered on to completely redundant sites that are on 24/7. The only difference here is it's at the cloud provider. What type we have depends on our needs, what we want to pay for, and how much downtime is acceptable. Then we talked about the lessons learned that we have to do after a disaster. There is so much critical information that we can use from this disaster to help to either mitigate or completely prevent the next one. What worked well, what did not work well, what can we improve, and then we use all that information in the next iteration of the plans. And then finally we talked about some of the common pitfalls we need to avoid with our BCP and DRP. And most of these tie back to the first one, lack of support from senior leadership. Because if we don't have that, then we probably don't have support from the business units either. If we don't have that, we won't have the right staff involved, which means we either get a too narrow or too broad scope, so when something actually happens, we may not have all the systems available that we need for our critical business functions. And then of course, we need to keep the plan up to date, and we need to have proper versioning. We can't just have Bob from home trying to fix something using the previous version. Either what he does nothing, or he does even more. And with that, we are done with disaster recovery planning. I hope this has helped you get a better understanding of the intricacies of disaster recovery. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lecture. In this and the next handful of lectures, we're going to talk about the last big topic of this domain, incident management. And it is super logical. How do we handle incidences? And the simple answer to that question is we monitor and detect security events on our systems, and then we use our incident response plan to pick the appropriate response. Incident management is an function, and this will protect all our. And the primary purpose here is to have very clearly and well understood and predictable response to any event and to make sure that we use those responses. We of course have gone through the proper planning, we have gone through the proper training, we have raised our staff's awareness, they know what to do when an incident happens, and we have trained them enough. And even though we can't train them for every single specific scenario, they're at the point where they understand how to react almost regardless what happens. And yes, I understand this is not how it works in many places in the real world, but for now, put that aside, you're studying for this exam, and here, everything is the perfect world. It is rainbows and unicorns. So we have those clearly defined processes, we have the responses. Everybody on our team is trained in those responses. They know what to do when something happens. And because they are trained so well, when something actually does happen, our response is going to be much more successful because we are prepared. We have done this before. This is the exact same reason why the military has so many exercises and drills. Because when you are in the actual situation that you trained for, it becomes secondhand. You know what you're supposed to do. The better you train for anything, the better you prepare your people, the better they're going to respond when something happens. And I think now is also a good point to recap how we categorize incidences and events in the three major disaster categories. Those were natural or nature, they are human, and they are environmental. And nature is anything that's caused by nature. Hurricanes, floods, earthquakes. It can just be rain or an abnormal amount of rain for the area that you're in. Or it could be like in Puerto Rico where I live. The infrastructure here is not super strong, so rain here can have an adverse effect all the way from an event to a disaster. And we'll cover those definitions in a minute and everything in between. So it's pretty common here, whenever it rains heavily, the power goes out or the internet goes out. Now, if we were an organization, we would have controls that would mitigate that. We would have a generator, we would have UPSs, we would have power banks, we would have internet that's not reliant on the infrastructure where we are. That could be satellite internet. I personally actually have many of those, exactly because I know how the infrastructure here can be. So that is nature. Next up, we have human, and that's all the stuff that is caused well by humans. That is both intentionally and unintentionally. And humans are by far the most common type of disaster we can have. It can be an attacker that attacks our network, or it can just be Bob going outside to get a cigarette and forgetting to close the door. And then the last category is environmental. And those are all the things in our environment. It is not the environment. That is the power grids, our servers, hardware, software, the plumbing, the walls. So all the stuff in our environment. We have also talked about how some incidences can be all three. Fire can be naturally occurring. Our stuff can catch on fire. Someone can start the fire. The same with water. It could just be heavy rain. It could be a pipe that burst, or it could be someone that intentionally or unintentionally left the water on. Regardless if it was intentional or unintentional, it can still damage our building and maybe even worse, our data center. So understand the differences between the three, understand what they are not, and understand that depending on the type, we need different countermeasures. We need different protection against a fire versus a fire started by equipment versus a fire started by someone. Now, if you can do that, if you go through that process, you can pretty much logic your way through any incident. You can take that incident and then you can categorize it in the right class. Now let's look at some of the definitions I talked about earlier. And we'll start with an event. An event is just an observable change to a state. It is not negative. It is not positive. It's just something changed in our environment. That can be a system powering on, or traffic on our network, or an application that starts. Someone swipes the badge to get into a room. It is something in our environment that is an event. An alert is a triggered warning that happens when a certain event occurs. And this is something we have pre-configured. These are if-then statements. If this happens, then do that. That could be that traffic utilization on this networking segment is above 75%, well, that triggers the alert. Or it could be memory utilization on this specific application is above 80% for more than 2 minutes, well then we trigger the alert. And as I mentioned, this is pre-configured. It is either something we have done or something that is done by the monitoring system we have in place. We configure it or the vendor configures it. But here we need to remember, just because the vendor says, yes, we have configured all these alerts, first off, we need to confirm that they're actually there. Secondly, just because there's an alert doesn't really do anything. We need to act on it. I have worked in many places where we just had red blinking lights on the SIEM or source system, but nobody really did anything. They were just there all the time. So if we don't respond to the alert, is there really a point in having the system? Next up, we have an incident. And an incident is when multiple adverse events happen on our systems or on our network. And most of these are caused by people. And the keyword here really is multiple. I think throughout the course and the training, you need to train your brain to spot those keywords because they are so critical on the exam. So if you see multiple and adverse, well then you know it is an incident. Alright, next up we have a problem. And a problem is an incident where we don't know how it happened. We're still going to do the same things to fix it, but here we're going to spend more time figuring out how did this happen. Because if we just fix the issue, we don't figure out the root cause, well then the problem is probably going to be back very soon. And the next time it could be much, much worse. So we spend the extra time. We do the root cause analysis, we do the lessons learned, we figure out what actually happened, what caused this, so we can fix the root cause and not have it happen again. Next up, we have an inconvenience or a non-disaster. This is a non-destructive failure. That could be a single disk that fails in a disk group. Obviously, assuming that we have that redundancy. So if that server is configured with RAID 5, meaning we have redundancy, we have striping, if either of those 3 disks fail, the server still continues to function without an issue. We obviously need to replace that disk as soon as possible, but the 2 disks that are left can continue to operate. And once we replace the 3rd disk, the data that was on the disk that died will be replicated onto the new disk. That is called a RAID array or a redundant array of independent disks. We will cover those more later. For the non-disaster, it could also be us having 2 servers in a cluster, meaning the servers are paired together in an active-active pair, so they're both processing traffic. If one server dies, the other server is just going to take over handling all the data while we fix the server that died. Again here, it's a non-disaster because nothing is destroyed, traffic isn't disrupted, it's an inconvenience. It is something that we need to fix and we need to fix very soon, but for our end users, for our customers, they will never know this happened. Next up, we have an emergency or a crisis. This is urgent. It is happening right now. It is imminent. And this is an event with the potential loss of life or property. We need to do something about this right now. Next up is disaster. And I do get some pushback from students saying, is this really the definition of a disaster? And it may not be how you define it where you work, in your life, but up until the point where you have taken and passed your exam, this is the definition. A disaster is when our entire facility is unusable for 24 hours or more, which then has given me some pushback on a snowstorm. Yes, a snowstorm can be a disaster. If our employees can't get to work, nothing will get done. The facility is unusable because no one can get there. Unless, of course, we have been clever and as part of our DR plan, we either have a geographically dispersed redundant site, meaning the same disaster will not affect the secondary site, or we have implemented some sort of solution where our employees can work from home. And here's a story that's a little bit funny and also a little bit sad. I was born and raised in Denmark. It snows every year. And in Denmark, we have pretty good public transportation. It is often faster and definitely cheaper to use public transportation versus having your own vehicle. But every year, it pretty much seems like it's a surprise to any of the public transportation. Oh, what? Wait, it snows here? Nobody told us about that. So every year, it takes them a couple of days to get ready for the snow, and then unless something drastic happens, the rest of the winter, public transportation works fine. But there's always that couple of days where they seem completely unprepared for this event that happens every year. The last time I lived in Denmark, I worked in the IP backbone of the largest internet service provider. We had maybe 80–90% of all the internet and phone customers in the entire country. So because of that, our infrastructure was deemed critical for the entire country, meaning, of course, we could work from home. And then one year, we had one of those especially bad snowstorms. Our technicians couldn't get out and do customer installs because every single road in the entire country was closed. But everybody else from our company could work from home. Our call center, our remote technicians, our IP backbone, all the people that had been deemed critical to keep the company going could work from home. Had we been a smaller internet service provider, well then we may not have had that ability. In that case, that snowstorm would have been a disaster because we can't do business for 24 hours or more. And then the last definition here, a catastrophe. A catastrophe is when our entire site is destroyed. We don't need a lot of examples here, right? The facility is destroyed. In this case, we would need our redundant site, our backup site, to get back into production. Or we would need some sort of other disaster recovery where we can do what we need to do from another location. Both for your exam and for your job, I would know these definitions, what they are and what they are not. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one. In this lecture, we're going to continue with incident management. And for incident management, I think it's important that we look at some of the frameworks that we can use. I don't think you need to know the actual frameworks in any depth because many of them have the same life cycle, so even though they're called something different, they're always in the same order. I am, however, going to call out NIST 800-61 and the incident response lifecycle. And as with any of these publications that I talk about, there will be links for them in the link section. Now let's look at who's involved in the Computer or Cyber Incident Response Team, the CIRT. We at least need to have senior management because they have to make the big decisions and they are accountable. Remember, they are ultimately liable. Then we need an incident manager, and their job is to manage the operational impact. We need a technical lead. That's someone who's responsible for all the technical teams, the networking team, the server team, the telecommunications team. Then we need someone from the security team, we need someone from our PR department, and we need someone from legal and human resources. The IT team, or maybe the cybersecurity team, are the ones that are responsible for containing the events. But we will also need the help from the server team, the networking team, and any of the other IT teams that make sense. If this is not just a logical attack, meaning someone has hacked us, we also might need someone who's responsible for physical security. That can be a guard or something like that. And then after the fact, we might have an IT auditor or a financial auditor. The financial auditor will help us for insurance purposes, and the IT auditor makes sure that all of our procedures are appropriate and that they're not outdated. They will be part of our lessons learned. Now let's look at an incident response lifecycle. For this one, we use an 8-step process. I would know what each step is, what we do in that step, and the flow of them. Don't just memorize it, but understand the logic behind it. So here initially, I'm just going to go through the steps real quick, and we're going to look at each step in detail. So just like with any good project, we start out with planning or preparation. Then we detect if something is wrong. That can also be called identification. Then we respond. We can refer to that as containment. We implement our mitigation strategies. You can also see that referred to as eradication. Then we report on the incident. And here we can sometimes go back to detection. After our mitigation, we look at, did we get everything? Are other systems compromised? If they are, well, rinse and repeat. Detection, response, mitigation. And we check again, did we get everything? Assuming that we did, well then we go into reporting. And this is a big one. This is us having the actual logs of what happened, what we did, and when we did it. Then we'll go into recovery, and this is getting all our systems back into an operational status, and then we go to remediation. And remediation is very similar to mitigation, but it is much, much broader. Mitigation is fixing the single system or systems that were impacted. Remediation is making sure that that specific security flaw is fixed on all the other systems, even though they were not compromised. And then finally, before we start the cycle over again, we do lessons learned. You may also hear it referred to as post-mortem reporting or post-incident activity. And we already talked about how this step is often ignored in the real world, and it's just a horrible, horrible idea. Luckily for the exam, we do everything right. So we do the lessons learned because they are so important. It's not just this incident we're fixing, we need to be better prepared for the next one. There are often other similar things that we can fix now. There were things that didn't work very well during this incident. What can we do to improve our response next time? Because we really need to get to that point where our approach is proactive and not reactive, meaning we fix many of the problems before they happen, and we don't just run around putting out fires. So now that we've done the high-level overview, let's look at each of these steps in more detail. So everything starts with planning or preparation. This is where we write our policies, our procedures. We train our staff. We make sure that we have the proper hardware and software to detect the issues. That we have all the right tools for our incident response team so they can act when something happens. The more we train our staff, the better tools they have, the better they're going to do. Whenever we have an incident, we're going to recover much faster, making that incident less impactful than it would have been had we not had the right tools. And if we have all that, it's also more likely that we can preserve the crime scene if there is one, meaning we may be able to prosecute whomever did this. We prepare. At some point, I was working in a data center, and shortly after I joined, I asked, do we have a disaster recovery plan? What do we do when something happens? And the answer was, yes, we do. It's right here, over on that shelf. I walked over to the shelf, found the disaster recovery plan, and it was actually pretty good, except it was 10 years old. No one had used it since it was made. No one had been trained on it. Most of the contact numbers in the plan were no longer in use. And most of the people in that plan didn't work there anymore. The systems we had at that point were completely different than the ones they had when the plan was made. So while it might have been an excellent plan 10 years earlier, it was completely unusable. So with incident management, just like our DRP and our BCP, it's an iterative process. It never stops. It's always happening. If anything changes in our environment, we update the plan. And now that I got that off my chest, let's look at detection. So detection is us realizing something is wrong. The better systems we have, the better they are configured to detect any intrusion, and assuming the intrusion is identified correctly, the better we are, the sooner we know. And I think maybe 99% of all security incidences is either of these two categories. It is us doing something that we shouldn't, or us not doing something that we should. Us doing something that we shouldn't could be Bob leaving the door open. He knows he shouldn't leave that door open, but he does it anyways. It's easier. Us not doing something that we should could be, there's a patch for this system, but we don't patch it. And almost all of the large security breaches we have seen over the last couple of years, whomever was attacked never realized. The only reason they found out is because someone will start posting their files on the internet. All of a sudden, their customer files or their payroll data shows up on the internet. Either they didn't have the proper detection in place, or they knew they were compromised and just said, oh, right, we were compromised 6 months ago, but we didn't tell anyone. And we didn't patch our systems because it's just too expensive. You obviously by now know this is not true. It's definitely possible to have too much security. It's definitely possible for it to be too expensive. But in those scenarios, when we have too much security, it's too stringent, it's because it's not based on a cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't meet our needs. We don't spend $100 to protect 20. Some years ago, I saw some studies that showed that for every dollar an organization spent on IT security when actually addressed the root cause of the problem and where the implementation was done right, they would save $10 for every single dollar spent. And just like with anything else in our organization, we can of course buy things for IT security and cybersecurity that we don't need or we implement incorrectly. But that's where we come in. We help with the right implementation. We help to guide management and governance to pick the right solutions that fixes the actual problem. So for the detection part, we can here use either intrusion detection or prevention systems. And they are exactly what they sound like. One detects intrusion, the other prevents it. And they can either be on a host, meaning a desktop or a server, or they can be on the network. In most places, we would use both. And then we have some sort of central repository where all our systems sends all the data they have on everything on the network, and then that centralized system, either a SIEM or a source system, it aggregates all that knowledge and it can see the full picture. And if we have everything configured right, it is much more likely that we will see something on the central system before we actually see it on the system they are attacking. The sooner we detect, the faster we can mitigate, and we can either completely avoid the incident or we can recover much faster and much better. And with that, we are done with this lecture. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one.